Hey, Bill. What's going on? Good evening and welcome to the Thursday, September 11th, 2014 meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission of Indian River County. The first item on our agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance, and Mr. Stewart maybe can lead us in that, please.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. The second item on our agenda is the approval of minutes from the August 28th, 2014 P&Z meeting.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Those Brognano and Day. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? No one opposed. First item, do I need to swear in an item on consent that's quasi-judicial?
No, not unless somebody objects to it.
Okay, so the first item is an item on consent, and that's the Reserve at Grand Harbor's request for modification of an approval condition for the Reserve at Grand Harbor development. Can I have a motion?
Motion to approve. Second.
Brognano and Rednauer. All in favor say aye.
Mr. Chairman, I didn't know if you wanted to ask anybody in the audience that wanted to be heard on the matter in consent.
Is there anyone in the audience who would like to be heard on this issue? Nope. Do I have a motion?
Motion to approve.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? No. Item number 4 is a public hearing. It is quasi-judicial. First thing I'm going to ask is if any of the commissioners have had any ex parte communications about this or feel in any way that they can't render a fair and impartial judgment. I have had some communication with Mr. Bowling today about this, but I still am more than capable of rendering an impartial judgment. Seeing as this is quasi-judicial, I believe we do have to swear in anyone who wishes to speak on this evening. So, yep, Rita, would you swear in anyone from the audience or the county who would like to speak this evening?
Do you swear, could you raise your right hand, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you.
You guys want to take it away?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chairman Zimmerman. John McCoy with the planning staff. This is a mixed-use plan development, and it's a mix of residential and commercial uses. It does require a PD rezoning as a mixed-use project. Process-wise, the applicant's pursuing both of these tracks simultaneously, the conceptual plan approval and the preliminary PD plan approval. For the preliminary PD plan approval, the Planning and Zoning Commission is to take final action subject upon the board's action on the rezoning and the conceptual plan approval. On the conceptual plan approval, the Planning and Zoning Commission is to make a recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners after the public hearing and hearing the presentation. And that will be transmitted to the Board of County Commissioners. If the board approves it, the applicant will be very close to that next step, which is the land development permit or land development permit waiver, and that's the actual point of construction. This is the subject site, and it's on the south side of State Road 60, and I'll use the mouse a little bit to illustrate some things. All of the property immediately east of the subject site is zoned general commercial, CG. To the north, across State Road 60, all of the property is also zoned general commercial, and this is some peripheral development from the mall, Lowe's. As you go to the south, across College Lane, slightly to the east, it's zoned general commercial, and this is actually a stormwater pond. And then as you go a little bit further west on the south side of College Lane, it's zoned RM6 and A1. Immediately adjacent to the subject site, to the west, the property is owned residential multifamily, and this is the 60 Oaks community. And a representative of the 60 Oaks community has been involved at the pre-app and the TRC level, and the applicant has also been in contact with the representative from the 60 Oaks community, so they're aware of the project. And then as you go further to the west are single-family subdivisions going to the west. With that, I'd like to get to the next slide, which is the aerial of the overall area. And it shows that the actual development of the area is consistent pretty much with the zoning. To the east of the subject site is Century Town Center, Olive Garden, Home Depot, commercial properties. To the south, the commercial area is vacant, but the multifamily area is developed with the high school, charter high school. And then as you go further west, south of College Lane is Indian River State College. To the immediately adjacent to the west of the subject site, again, is 60 Oaks. And then you have the single-family residential development to the west of that. North across College Lane, Lowe's and the mall peripheral development. And it shows that this is an infill site. The subject or the sites immediately adjacent to the subject site are all developed in one manner or another. So this is the last parcel to be developed in this immediate area. And as such, it is an infill parcel, and it is a transition parcel from a land use perspective. And let me put up a land use map. Again, to the north, this RC is regional commercial, so this is a periphery of the mall. Commercial, all to the east of the subject site. To the south of the subject site is a residential land use, but it's really institutionally developed. And then residential property immediately west of the subject site, and a residential use immediately west of the subject site. So that was one of the considerations in looking at the design for this plan, was that transition as far as uses go. With that, I'll get to the development proposal. And the site is just under 20 acres. It's 19.99 acres. The proposal is for 159 multifamily units. Those are 7 three-story buildings and 3 commercial out parcels. This is the layout for the proposed, and I've switched the north arrow. So north is now to the right. So I don't want to disorient anybody, but it lays out better this way, and it's the way the rest of the slides continue with north to the right. In this slide, west is going to be to the top. So 60 Oaks is up here. The commercial developments to the south. The brown footprints are the footprints for the commercial, and those front State Road 60. The mustard-colored buildings are the residential, and these are the 7 three-story residential buildings, and this is the clubhouse, and then College Lane to the south. This is an aerial overlay of the immediate area with the footprint of the site plan superimposed on it. So you have the 3 commercial parcels immediately adjacent to 60, the residential development, and you can see the attributes of the subject site. And I would like to mention that it was cleared for a previous residential development. It had a previous residential development approved in 2007, went through the site plan approval process, got to just the initial point of construction, land clearing and permitting, and then stalled at that point in time. So that this site was cleared consistent with the design for that project. The next slide, I'd like to talk about traffic circulation. It does have 3 access points. Has an access point on State Road 60, which is limited to a right-in, right-out. There's a median in State Road 60, so that'll limit the driveway to right-in, right-outs. It also has a right turn lane required for the driveway. To the east, it will be interconnected with the Century Town Center site, and this is right behind the Olive Garden, so that's where the driveway connection will be. And then south of the subject, or on the south side of the subject site, is a full movement driveway, so you can go right or left out of this driveway, and it will have a right turn lane as you come from the east and are westbound towards the State College. I would like to point out that County Traffic Engineering approved the traffic study, approved the off-site improvements, approved the internal circulation, and there is a copy of the executive summary of the traffic study attached to the staff's report. As far as dedications, improvements, and conditions, some of the improvements are a transit stop on State Road 60, sidewalk along the College Lane frontage, which will extend that sidewalk, and then an off-site sidewalk to close a gap to the to the east, going towards 58th Avenue to create that sidewalk from the subject site all the way to 58th Avenue and close that gap. There's also the right turn lane that I mentioned on State Road 60, the right turn lane on College Lane. As far as conditions that you'll see attached to this, there is a zoning reverter such that the subject site would revert to RM8 if no construction occurs within 7 years. There's a drive-through restriction restricting the drive-through use to the eastern two out parcels and not the western out parcel, which is immediately adjacent to 60 Oaks. And one of the, in developing the mixed-use criteria, let me talk about this for just a second. The mixed-use criteria were developed in the last, say, 4 years. The criteria were amended to allow drive-through restaurants with certain design conditions met, and as being one of the more auto-intensive uses, and that's the reason for the concern there. And then lastly, the timing condition that you'll see, and this is also one of the mixed-use criteria related to the mixed-use criteria. While the mixed-use criteria were being developed, there was a debate and a back and forth between how much commercial is appropriate to be developed versus how much residential. So you don't get all the commercial without the residential, but there'd be allowance for some commercial. And it was arrived at that you could develop up to 3 acres without building any residential. But once you got to that 3-acre threshold, you'd have to build 25% of the residential. And that's essentially the timing condition to ensure that that criterion is actually met. And you'll see that condition in the staff's report in the conditions. With that, I'd like to get to the landscape plan. And the items I'd like to point out on the landscape plan, and I'll use the mouse to illustrate, is immediately adjacent to 60 Oaks on the very southern edge is a 25-foot Type B landscape area. And that's essentially where the applicant's proposing a multifamily residential adjacent to a residential area. And then as you come closer to State Road 60 to the north, it gets to the preserve area where you have a wider width. Again, it's a requirements for a Type B buffer with a 6-foot opaque feature in this area. But again, it's a much wider separation from the physical improvements. And then as you go further north, it necks back down, and there is a Type B, what I'll call a Type B plus, because it has the understory and shrubs for a Type A buffer, which is our most intense buffer, and it's 35 feet wide rather than 25 feet wide. So that's the area that staff has had the greatest compatibility concern. Also, along this property line, not related to landscaping, but it does affect the landscape design somewhat, is there is a drainage ditch, and it's my understanding that that drainage ditch is the outfall for 60 Oaks and does provide some drainage for 60 Oaks. So the applicant's trying not to make any modifications to that ditch or change the change the grading at all. There we go. When you get to the south, the east perimeter, where the residential community is, or residential is proposed against commercial, there's a Type B buffer with a 6-foot opaque feature. There's also lake shoreline plantings around the lake, and this white area in the center is the lake. And then along the roadways, it's our standard county landscaping strip, thoroughfare plan strip along College Lane and along State Road 60. You'll see these grayed out parcels because those landscape plans have yet to be developed for those 2 commercial out parcels. As far as environmental aspects of the site, as I said, the site was cleared with the previous development. As part of that previous development, they did accommodate the native upland set-aside, which they were required to preserve 0.91 acres. That area is going to remain at the same location intact, and they provided a conservation easement prior to being able to clear the other portion of the site. There are no wetlands on the site. Planting of the 24 mitigation trees is required for removal of specimen trees. And basically, specimen trees are hardwood trees over 13 inches in diameter at chest height, or 13 or over, and the mitigations are required at a ratio of 2 to 1. So that would be 72 inches of mitigation, because those mitigation trees need to be 3 inches in diameter and it was 72 inches of mitigation, so it's 36 inches of caliper, 36 caliper inches being removed. As far as phasing goes, the green area is phase 1, and there are two aspects I'd like to point out on the phasing plan. One is from an internal circulation standpoint. All of the internal circulation system will go in, so you can get from State Road 60 to College Lane and also to the adjacent commercial parcel. So that'll be front-ended. The other items that I'd like to point out are the two commercial users on the east and west side are under that 3-acre limit, and those will be developed along with some residential, but they'll need to get to that 25% threshold, which is 40 units before they can move on to phase 2. And phase 2 is essentially the remainder of the residential and the center commercial parcel. And again, they'll have to commence construction on 25%, 40 units, before they can commence construction on the commercial parcel in phase 2. And that's part of the mixed-use criteria. As far as architectural design, and again, this gets back to the mixed-use criteria because there's supposed to be a common thematic element to unify the project architecturally, design-wise, landscape-wise. These are the residential, or one version of the residential building. Again, it's a 3-story building. You can see the architecture. You see the colors. You can see the materials. These are preliminary. They'll be further refined as they go through the process. This is the clubhouse building, the smaller building that I showed you. This is the center out parcel, the retail building. And this will be the elevation that faces State Road 60. This will be the elevation that faces the parking lot. This will be the back side, and this will be the driveway side. Now, in this particular instance, the architect has illustrated the foundation plantings that will be provided. Again, it's a rendering, so the actual volume may be more or less than what's illustrated. This is one of the proposed users on the eastern out parcel, which is the Chick-fil-A. Again, architecturally, they're incorporating the stonework. We're looking at getting a color that's more consistent with one of the colors of the architectural buildings, and then a little bit of roof work. And again, this doesn't show any of the foundation plantings, but foundation plantings will be required with the actual construction of the site. This is the elevation that will face State Road 60, the top elevation. This is the back side or the south side. This is the entry that faces the parking lot, and this is the drive-through side, which will be the west side of the building. The last user is proposed to be a Longhorn Steakhouse, and this northern illustration or rendering is the State Road 60 side, which is the front of the building. The one just below it is the back or the south side. The east side is this elevation, and then the west side, which will be on the 60 Oak side, is this bottom right elevation. And again, these will all have foundation plantings, so you won't see quite as much architectural detail. They'll have shrubs, understory trees, and canopy trees planted within the foundation area. As far as public benefits, they're needing to build that off-site sidewalk to fill the gap in the existing sidewalk segment between the subject site and 58th Avenue. And that essentially gets them over to the area of Ruby Tuesdays and the sidewalk that runs north and south along 58th Avenue. And then construct the transit stop and transit shelter. And again, that's part of the mixed-use criteria. That gets us to the recommendation. We do recommend that the Planning and Zoning Commission grant preliminary PD approval subject to the board's action, and recommend that the Board of County Commissioners approve the rezoning and conceptual plan for the reserve at Vero Beach with the conditions listed in the staff's report. And that includes the architectural elevations, the mitigation, landscape improvements, the sidewalks along College Lane, the turn lanes on College Lane and State Road 60, the transit stop, the zoning reverter, the drive-through restriction, and the timing on the commercial development. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I ask the applicant to come up and talk, I'm going to ask the commissioners if they have any questions. I certainly know I have a lot, but I'll hold on until any of the rest of you have any comments or questions.
I have a couple. On page 8 of your report, you talk about, in section 11, it's talk about parking. And you look at the required and the proposed. And for the restaurant parking, required is 84 and proposed is 126. And for the retail, 36 is required and 38. Why such a discrepancy? Can those parking spaces be more equally balanced? I mean, if 84 required and they're proposing 126, why such a high number for that?
Let me say two things. One is typically within a commercial development, there's reciprocal easement, so they can share parking back and forth. So physically convenient parking is often used and shared between sites. Secondly, some of the national franchise users, especially the restaurant users, have their own standards which exceed the county standards, and oftentimes the developers are providing additional parking based on the corporate standards in excess of the county standards. And I'm sure that's what's happening here on one of the sites.
I have a couple of sidewalk questions. On page 9, for the external sidewalk, and it says that the applicant is proposing to build other off-site sidewalks on the north side of College. Is that required, or is that voluntary?
It's required as one of the public benefits, and that's one of the public benefits of this project, is to make that a continuous sidewalk segment, so there is the ability to get from essentially the charter school area, the south end of this site, over to 58th Avenue. So that would be a public benefit that we would look for as a requirement within the first phase of the development.
Yeah, there are. You can go around town and see some of the other developments where sidewalks just terminate, and you know that they'll never be completed, and so that's really good.
Especially when the site's already developed, because then there's not an impetus to actually develop the sidewalk. Yes.
For the internal sidewalks, in the last sentence of that section on page 9, it says the pedestrian system will be connected, the internal and external will be connected. Is that required or voluntary?
That's required, and again, we're looking for the sidewalk segments to come out to College Lane, and I think you can see this on your screens, but not on the overall screen, and also to connect to stub out, so you can also walk.
Can you show the visual of that on the screen? Thank you. Thanks, John.
So these are the connections to the State Road 60 sidewalk at these points. And then to the College Lane sidewalk will be right here. And then you can see these are more of informal pedestrian paths at this point, and then a sidewalk in this area.
And my last question is about the road that goes through the development from Route 60 to College Lane. Is that going to be a popular shortcut for students coming into the college? Is there going to be an unusual traffic flow there? And also coming out onto Route 60, is there going to be a left-hand turn light there?
Yeah. There will not be a left-hand turn lane, and it's hard to gauge how popular things get and how well they get discovered and how convenient they are for anybody's given route. It does lead to a good question, and I should have put this in my presentation. It is proposed to be ungated, so certainly that it is open for transit through the site.
And if I could add to that, just for the record, Stan Bowling, County Community Development Director. I think it's good that it be ungated and it proposed to be that way. Of course, it is kind of a circuitous route, and a more direct route is actually the driveway, which really acts much more like a street, even though it does have some speed bumps in it. That comes across the western perimeter of Century Town Center, and so that serves a pretty useful purpose for a cut through, and it's probably a more direct route than this will be.
Yeah. One of the concerns that I have, if you're heading west on 60 and you're at that light, the intersection of the mall there, is the amount of traffic that is doing U-turns that's associated with it because of the inability to turn left. I've seen that on a personal level, where I think maybe if there's maybe the applicant can just talk about that.
You can turn left into here and go right in.
Yeah.
And I think is the intersection you're talking about further west than the slide actually
Yeah,
depicts?
that's correct.
Okay, so it's the main entry to the mall at that point. Okay, I understand what you're talking about. Okay.
I have no other questions.
Anyone else have any other questions before I?
Sam. I've got a couple more, but go.
Can you go back to the location map, please? One of your first slides. Okay, so what we're being asked to do here today is rezone from RM8 to PD. I think that's one of the, and then a secondary thing we're being asked to do is to approve a preliminary site plan. So let me just start with the rezoning, and let me see if I can ask some questions so that I understand better and can maybe be a little more satisfied. So I look at the properties that are to the north of this property and that are to the east of this property, and I see that they are appropriately zoned CG, general commercial. They're heavy retail. Now, I look to the east of to the west of this property, and I looked at the larger map, and it's residential pretty much all the way up to Point West. Now, appropriate zoning, from what I know, goes something like this: general commercial, step down zoning to multifamily, and then to single family, or duplexes in this case, and then maybe to single family. Mm-hmm. That's what you want to see in a. That's what's in the textbook for, what appropriate zoning is. So I start from the presumption that the current zoning, which is RM8, is an appropriate zoning. And I think one of the questions we need to ask ourselves right off the bat is, what is the problem with the current zoning that would require us to rezone it to allow commercial on State Route 60 when what is currently shown on this map is entirely appropriate? That's number one. And number two, why are we doing it through a PD instead of just a simple rezoning? Why isn't the applicant coming to us and saying, we want commercial on part of our parcel? Because my general understanding of PDs, going back years of being on this commission and others, is it's kind of a quid pro quo that goes like this. The developer comes to the county and says, I don't want to comply with all of your, with your codes, with your basic code in terms of setbacks, in terms of any number of things. But I've got a really good idea, and if you give me some relief on some of these things, we can sit down together and make something really great. And that's kind of the quid pro quo. And what I see this development being is commercial on the front, Chick-fil-A, Longhorn Steakhouse, commercial on the front with multifamily on the back. Let me put it a different way. Under the current zoning, which I believe is appropriate for this parcel, they could build up to 159 units of multifamily on this parcel. What they're in front of us asking us to do tonight is to build 159 units, same number, on a smaller portion of that land, and 18,318 square feet of commercial. You all know me very well. I am not opposed to development. To the contrary, I think it's a very healthy thing for our community, and especially now. And so I've thought long and hard about this and talked to Stan Bowling about it for quite some time to try to get as many answers as I could answer, and I've got more questions tonight to ask. But it starts with, I believe that the current zoning is appropriate, and I don't know that there's any public benefit at all. And I don't see that the plan that's in front of us tonight, which is under the PD, is any kind of this is supposed to be mixed use. Does this look like mixed use to you? This looks like commercial on the front and apartments stuck on the back. This doesn't look like,
Well-
and if you, let me give you an example of what I mean by that. When I go through the long list of mixed-use PD things that are in here, to try to read what the requirements are, to try to understand, and I think I already do understand, but to confirm my understanding of what the intent of mixed-use PD would be, which I think was to create something, hey, we're not going to comply with all your codes, we got something a little better in mind, you give us a little here, and we're going to enhance here, and we're going to come up with something so that we can be creative in the code. Let me give you an example. On page 12, in the second paragraph, it talks about the vertical mixing of uses. That's typically what we're talking about, some kind of new urbanist mixed use, restaurants on the first floor, apartments above. It says, is allowed and strongly encouraged. That informs me as to what the intent of what people were trying to accomplish when they wrote this section of the code. Moving on a little bit, and I did have a question specifically about this. It talks about allowing drive-throughs. Now, drive-throughs were not in the original part, but they were added later. But with some misgivings, because there's a lot of restrictions on how this can be. And it says it cannot be adjacent to residential. Now, I say it's adjacent because one parcel is adjacent to the other. Now, I guess there's another restaurant in between the drive-through and the other restaurant. But one of the questions I had of staff right off the bat was, it says that right here, and in the note at the bottom, that it says the proposed drive-through is 200 feet away from the closest residential unit within the proposed development. But is that really true? Because when I look on the back, when it says recommendations, number 4 is any fast food restaurant with a drive-through is restricted to the easternmost and middle commercial parcels. It doesn't say to just the one that's on the furthest. It says it could be either of those. So, I don't think that's really true. First of all, I think it is adjacent. The two parcels are adjacent to one another. They are contiguous. But moreover, it's really not true that it's just limited to the easternmost. It's the condition is that it be two of those parcels, not just one of them. Again, I'm trying to look for intent. I want to talk about the density for a second. PD mixed use. If you were going to come into you do not lose the density of the entire parcel. That's why I say they have 159 units before of the entire parcel. Now they have 159 units in a condensed sort. So effectively, they are at 10 units to the acre, not 8 units to the acre, which is the underlying zoning. Mm-hmm. And that was meant, I believe, the intent to be an inducement for the developer to come in and come up with something creative and interesting. In this thing, it's kind of a perverse. It's reverse of what we want. We have just really plain commercial out front, and we have more density on the rear than really what our community has decided it wants in its codes. That troubles me. Now, I don't think there are any public benefits to this, and I'd just like to say, it says all mixed, it says one of the benefits is that it has a transit stop. But if you look at page 13, number 13, one of the requirements is that it has a transit stop. That's a requirement of even doing a PD. I don't see how that's some kind of bonus to the community. That's just a threshold issue for them. Number 14. This is another thing that informs me about my concept of what the PD was meant to do when it was written. It says within mixed-use PDs, common architectural themes, common hardscape, signage themes, multiple pedestrian connections, all those types of things. And it goes on to say the project has been designed to meet that. That tells me it's supposed to be a unified place. A unified place. A joining together of the uses, commercial and residential. Maybe an extreme example of it might be City Place down in Palm Beach or something like that. But that is a unified place. And in the note there says the project has been designed to meet this criteria and providing common architectural themes. And I'm thinking to myself, boy, that's really stretching it. What is that? They're using the same paint on the buildings? That's not. Maybe it technically meets it, but I have my doubts about that. But I don't think that it meets at all the spirit of what mixed-use PD was meant to be. The street network, it says it's supposed to be a grid or a modified grid pattern. Small point. I don't believe it is. Here's another thing I want to say. The busiest intersection in this county, and I you know from me being on this long time, I tend not to want to question traffic engineers, but I do know this. The busiest intersection in this county is 58th and 60th. 58th and 60th. Mm-hmm. And what we're contemplating doing is swapping, this is going to certainly add to the traffic there, no doubt about it. We're contemplating swapping 159 units for 159 units and 18,318 square feet of commercial, 2 parcels of which could be drive-throughs. For what public benefit? Does it improve the current zoning? No. I don't. I think a more honest approach, if we want to debate whether or not State Route 60 on this parcel should be commercial or not, this should be a rezoning, a lot split and a rezoning to this commercial. This PD route is not the right way to go. It's not the right way to go. It was not the intent of what this PD mixed-use thing was originally meant to do, and I think it's a very poor vehicle for doing it. And I think it lowers, the bar quite substantially, and I think it's contrary to what the voters and the political leadership of this county intend in terms of the density and the quality of development in this county. And that's really maybe more of a statement than some questions, but I wanted to be able to say it before the applicant got up to speak so that maybe they can allay some of my concerns, some of my fears, and speak directly to them. But I have very serious misgivings about this particular development. Yes,
Mr. Chairman, if you wouldn't mind, you raised a lot of good points. In fact, a lot of things that staff considered as well. And I'm wondering, John, if you can go back to the zoning map, the location map. I doubt I'm not sure if I'll have the ability to hit on all the points that you made, but yeah, starting here. Staff's position is that there is not a problem with the existing zoning. RM8, and I agree with that, residential multifamily up to 8 units per acre, it's not problematic. It is between lower density residential as far as transitions go to commercial. And this is an option. This rezoning is an option to go mixed use, and there's a couple of reasons for that. But one thing that is important, and it is kind of part of getting residential in the State Road 60 corridor. Right now, our plan is such to try to have a mix overall, say from State Road 60 all the way into town, or at least to 43rd Avenue in the unincorporated area, to not have solely commercial uses along State Road 60. And in fact, it enhances your commercial areas to have residents nearby if they have good access and there's not an over amount of congestion there. So I think it is important for there to be multifamily residential development on this site to be in the State Road 60 corridor. And you're exactly right. There are incentives to try to get this PD rezoning and to go through the mixed-use process to get the same number of multifamily units on the site and to get, as you pointed out correctly, about 18,000 square feet of commercial. And it's pretty high volume commercial, too. It's retail. But I do think that this is, as far as the location goes, this is an appropriate location for a mixed-use design. We'll get to design in a moment because that too has, I think, a lot of good issues to talk about. But I think in terms of the unincorporated area of the county, this is one of the busier areas and an area where you would expect there to be, if we're going to have mixed use, for it to be here. Mixed use is, I think, it is kind of difficult. I think conceptually even the different types of places where it might be appropriate. We've talked about it replacing the neighborhood commercial, and we had the Gifford Family Dollar, and I think there was agreement that was a good application of mixed use. because you had kind of a neighborhood commercial store and a good spot for that, and integrated in with some future residential and existing residential, and really a high-density area with a lot of foot traffic. That worked. Then on the other end of the scale, you have traditional neighborhood design, which is much larger projects, a Point West, a Liberty Park, a Providence Point. And there, it's easier to do mixed use in the more traditional sense, where you have residential right beside commercial and more of an urban feel, or an amenity center or an activity center. This is one of those in-between sites. As John pointed out, it is an infill site. And I think the location here makes sense for a mixed use. It meets the location criteria for it. I think the biggest issues that staff had in looking at this particular proposal was really the design issues. And I'll get down to that here and kind of go over a couple things just real briefly, because I want you guys to speak. But just in terms of how do you do mixed use in a suburban context like this without, and you're correct, vertical mixing would be great, city place would be great, but it's not required. And so part of the questions we had was, well, if you line buildings up along a street, which there is a main north-south street here, two of the commercial uses are off of it. It terminates at the clubhouse for the residential, so you actually have some of the activity area of the residential near the commercial here. But you're right, in an urban type of form, you wouldn't have this. You would have buildings lining up here, but then you'd have the parking behind it. And I'm not sure that there's kind of a question of what would you gain from that type of design, that type of layout. But I agree with you. There's no question the developer is getting much more than the 159 units that the current zoning allows. The commercial is oriented completely toward the State Road 60 side. The integration that there is with a main north-south street and a main east-west street, and that main east-west street lines up with the existing stub out there that's south of Olive Garden. So that kind of makes sense to have it in that location.
Let me ask the question this way. How is this conceptual plan any different? This is a PD. How is this any different than what would be shown to us with a commercial zoning in the front and a multifamily zoning in the back, except for that they wouldn't get the density bonus?
Right, and the integration of the commercial. Basically, they're sharing. You have residential and commercial sharing a common street and sidewalk system. And you would, John was. You would buffer. You would separate out the uses. You wouldn't be going directly from one to the other here. So I think that's probably the major advantage. The other thing that staff is looking at here, and these are excellent.
It'd probably be more appropriate for them to be buffered.
Well.
Typically, residential wants to be buffered from commercial,
that's certainly
particularly if it's just a general retail and multifamily. This isn't really PD, mixed use in terms of, boy, these are together and these are special and they really speak to one another and there's a synergy there. This is commercial on State Route 60 with a multifamily bonus in the back.
And the other point that I wanted to make that. Staff's observation, I think Lake in the Woods was probably the last market rate multifamily we had developed on State Road 60. Mm-hmm. And so I actually think, from planning staff's point of view, this is actually part of an incentive to get multifamily in the area. Unfortunately, that seems to be, the market reality. We're not in a metro area. We have a slow absorption rate, and I think those things factor into it. But I don't disagree at all with any of your observations in terms of this is definitely an increase, and this design is not at all an urban type of design. It is an auto-dependent suburban layout that integrates that type of form between these uses, and it's really nothing more than that in terms of the layout itself.
Stan, can you address the adjacent issue on the drive-through restrictions?
And that's a good
criteria.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think that is addressed correctly in the item. The bottom line is that the board did approve allowing with all these criteria for a drive-through facility, and so you're really looking at two things. One is the existing adjacent residential here is 60 Oaks right here. And so with a restriction or a prohibition that there be no drive-through facility here, you don't have a drive-through facility that's close to this existing residential here. Okay. Now, with respect to this residential building, which is the one that's furthest to the north, from either this building here, which actually proposes a drive-through facility, or if you were to have a drive-through facility at this building, both would be more than 200 feet away from this residential building itself. And so it's not that it's on an adjacent parcel, it's that, what's the adjacency? Is there enough separation between the two, and as they're buffering? So that's essentially what, the way that the criteria were set up. Not site to site, but really looking at the separation. That's the way we look at adjacency.
If there were substantial public benefit, or if this parcel was burdened with a zoning that was inappropriate,
Let me ask you this: Is it staff's opinion it's not practical to develop this under its current zoning in trying to encourage multi-zoning projects?
I mean, we're not marketing experts, so I don't know. I mean, I think in terms of zoning itself, I think RM8 is inappropriate. I don't think it's inappropriate, but I also think that they do meet the.
I'm just trying to determine the public
criteria.
benefit question.
Right, and I think, and again, the public benefit question is you get an integration of commercial and residential uses with vehicular interconnections, a shared north-south street, a shared east-west street, and pedestrian interconnections.
Let's not forget the jobs that are going to be created with those 3 new businesses too, and that is a public benefit.
This developer said they can develop 159 units on this site. Will there be 159 units with the 18,000 of commercial, or there will be 159 units?
I guess I question just the interconnectivity. You've got some consistency in architecture, but are they really interconnected? And if you're a resident of this community, do you really want that connectivity, if it applies?
Yeah, I think there are plenty of places in this county, in fact, most places in the county, and probably the city too, developed with conventional zoning where you completely screen off, shut off commercial from residential. So there's plenty of those places to live and to be near. This is an alternative that allows a little bit more adjacency. But again, there's no question. This is not an urban design. This is a suburban design.
Precedent or adequate comparisons to what's being proposed that has the retail component that's mixed in at the level of restaurant planning and the heavy traffic and the density that's going to be inflicted?
Yeah, there's a couple of things I will note on this. I think the fact that there is access onto College Lane, the parallel road to the south, is a big thing. I mean, if a resident would want to avoid completely the State Road 60 in the front, they have that rear entrance. I can't think of too much that's actually built out in the county that's that way. Point West actually has commercial along State Road 60. They've got the medical office building, but no residential right behind it.
Very different type of commercial that's being proposed here.
Correct. This is high intensity.
This is high intensity.
Yes, it is.
But you brought up a great question. Is the commercial an amenity to the residential? I mean, ask yourself, is the Chick-fil-A and the Longhorn and the parking lots and the way that's designed, where a PD mixed use, they're supposed to amenitize one another?
It's a different feel than a Point West, for certain.
Yeah. Or is this just commercial with residential bonus in the back? That's what it looks like to me.
Stan, and John, I just had a couple of questions. As far as the Chick-fil-A and the Longhorn, are those two set in stone? Are they definitely going to be in, or are they just a hope of the developer?
Those two are not. Is my understanding in conversations with the applicant that those two are fairly firm, but certainly not locked in or guaranteed, and there could be changes or other users certainly on those sites, but they are.
Okay.
Which is why the plan that's proposed sets up the size of the building and the general use, and then there's an architectural review requirement that's part of the condition.
Could the middle parcel, commercial parcel, be a drive-through restaurant?
With the current condition, yes, and that gets back to part of the PD and part of the PD restrictions, rather than if you were to go straight zoning, the ability to set up conditions to say this parcel is appropriate for a drive-through or these types of uses potentially, and as you get further east, allowing a little bit more intensity in types of uses. And that's the way that staff approached it with that particular drive-through restriction. Is one of the benefits of the PD zoning is being able to look at a design and really gauge the intensity and gauge the layout.
Following up on the Chick-fil-A, Stan, on your Friday afternoon mail out that you send out, Chick-fil-A had planned to come in somewhere along the State Road 60 corridor, hadn't they? Did they have a site plan in?
This may be the location. I mean, you're talking about locally in this area?
Yes.
Yeah. I think a few of the fast food restaurants are looking for standalone places, and Chick-fil-A is one of them. They've been looking different places.
And John, did you say that the center retail parcel could be used for fast food?
Correct. The way the condition that we have proposed in the staff report, which is condition number 4 on page 16, it allows the easternmost 2 parcels to be used for fast food and just restricts the fast food use from the western one.
Okay.
So, and again, that's a condition of the PD that the staff is proposing, but one of the things that are able to be done through a plan development application.
Yeah, that seems rather difficult. I'm looking at the parking that's proposed. It's required is 36 for Lot 2 retail and proposed is 38. Seem to make it rather difficult.
Correct. Design-wise, it could be challenging.
I don't know of any retail drive-through that has that limited amount of parking. Starbucks, yep. Good point.
Absolutely.
And drive-through, yeah. And it could be a good spot for a Starbucks.
58th. Tell me about 58th and 60th. What is the current rating of that intersection in terms of how, they rate it A on down? What's the grade of 58th and 60th today?
I don't know the grade of the different approaches to that intersection. I know that when traffic engineering looked at this project, and there may be a traffic engineer from the applicant that could go into more detail, this project was not considered significant at that intersection, and so they didn't have any, what we call substantial impact to the level of service for that intersection.
And, I'm not a traffic engineer, and I'm very uncomfortable, questioning them too much. But I got to tell you, that sounds a little funny to me. That 18,000 square feet of retail and 158 units would have no impact on 58th and 60th. I know it does say, when I look at this reserve at Vero Beach, number 6, it says significant intersections, none. Now, that might mean something different from what the plain language of the text is, but that seems very hard for me to believe. But maybe there's some other explanation. I would just say that it's hard for me to believe that Longhorn Steakhouses, maybe a drive-through on the middle parcel, certainly a drive-through on the easternmost parcel, would not be significant trip generators. I mean, if not, those are very successful restaurants. They have a lot of customers driving in and out of there all the time.
Yeah, and I think they are significant generators, and they have a certain amount of pass-by traffic and so forth. But again, the only point I'm making is that traffic engineering confirmed that the impact of the proposed development would not be significant on the level of service of the intersection.
Really?
Does that intersection have a good level of service?
I think overall, I couldn't tell you what I know that the northbound left turn, where the dual lefts going west, is probably the most congested turning movement still.
Is that the busiest intersection in the county?
I think that's the busiest left turn that we have. It's one of the busiest we have, if not the busiest. 4th Street US 1 is pretty busy too.
Yeah. Cool.
Last question that I had, John, I just didn't see it on the slide. The clubhouse is a Phase 2 improvement, not Phase 1?
At this point, yes, it's proposed in Phase 2.
Thank you.
Any other questions? This is a public hearing, so I'm inclined at this point to open up that portion of the meeting. If you guys
want to let the applicant speak first before.
Yeah, but can that be part of the public hearing, or is it no? Okay, please. come up and introduce yourself, name and address for the record. Maybe you can address some of our concerns and questions.
Not actually sure I want to be up here. Bruce Barquette, representing SR60 Veros LLC, and representing the applicant. Let me just answer a couple of questions.
I don't think you're on. Can you see it? Press that button out.
Hello?
Yep.
Yeah? Okay. Maybe just...
Do I have to lean down to talk?
You may have to, yes.
That's kind of dehumanizing.
Take your shoes off.
Jeez. Let me just answer a couple of questions. First, the Longhorn is not as sure a thing as the Chick-fil-A is. So the Chick-fil-A is almost locked in. Longhorn is not almost locked in. One of the public benefits that staff failed to mention is the turn lane on College Lane is also a public benefit, and I don't believe that was a required project improvement. We support the staff recommendation 100% except for the condition that prohibits drive-through restaurants on the parcel 1, which is the westernmost parcel. And I want to correct one thing. Actually, let me correct a couple of things. First of all, this parcel, not just this kind of property, this specific parcel was one of the properties we looked at when we drafted the MXD ordinance. Stan can attest to that. John can attest to that. This is kind of a sad night for me because I've been looking at this property for over 15 years. Stan and John and I have looked at several different iterations and several different developers. And Mr. Evans, you actually touched right on it. This property will not be developed residentially at 8 units per acre. There are two reasons for that. One is 8 units per acre simply isn't enough units to make it economically viable. And two, even if you could get enough units, even if you doubled it to 16 units per acre, we don't have the absorption rate to make it economically viable. So the commercial use does make the residential use possible. The developer, the property owner here tonight, is ready to go forward with this project and ready to build the residences, but only with the commercial component. So, Mr. Zimmerman, about the only thing you said that I agree with is the commercial component is pulling the residential component here, and that's absolutely true. If you want residences on this property, and they're a good thing, and I'll tell you why they're a good thing, and I learned this from the staff, you want residential use near the goods and services that are going to benefit from it. You want it near the restaurants and near the services and near the retail stores and near the malls. But on this particular property, at this particular location on State Road 60, you will not get that without a commercial use. And I, like I said, I've got 15 or 16 years of experience with this particular property. I can say that through at least 3 separate developers and probably, I don't know how many plans we've seen. It just ain't going to happen. But the other thing is, mixed uses, your ordinance says mixed use PDs shall be limited to areas designated L1, L2, M1, or M2, and shall be located along State Road 60. So to say that this property is not appropriate for mixed use is a fallacy. Again, this particular property is one of the ones we looked at when we drafted this ordinance, and your ordinance is drafted to mention State Road 60 specifically in this particular land use. Secondly, the drive-through window restrictions don't prohibit drive-through restaurants adjacent to residential properties. What it prohibits are the drive-through facility from being adjacent to the residential property. Now, I know that sounds like I'm making up that distinction, but I'm not. If you read the ordinance, what it says is, drive-through facilities shall be designed not to wrap around more than 2 sides of the restaurant. They differentiate between facilities and restaurant. And then the prohibition says, drive-through facilities shall not be located adjacent to an off-site property with an existing residential use. So that brings up 2 points. One, the facility is the drive-up window itself, and I believe Stan will agree with me on that. But secondly, the properties that are adjacent to lots 2 and 3 within this project are not off-site properties. So they're on-site properties. Those are part of this project. So the proximity to those is not relevant under your ordinance. So when you're saying that it is adjacent, again, that makes no sense to me. That's just not accurate. Again, I'm pretty excited to be here because, like I said, I've been working on this property for a long time. The applicant and Mr. Vitter and myself and Mr. Woodward, Steve Cohen is here from the applicant's site team. We've been working with the staff for over a year on this particular site plan. And because it's a PD, your staff has had an unusual amount of input into the site plan, and this developer has been more than willing to comply with the staff's requests. And we've met several times with the 60 Oaks people, and we've got their representative was Ms. Jody Simons, I believe her last name was. I'm sorry, Jody Owens, and she submitted a letter, which each of you have. They don't have any objection to this project. We think it's a good project, and we comply with all of the rules and regulations in the code, notwithstanding what Mr. Zimmerman was saying, and your staff agreed with that. We request that you approve this project, but we do also request that you not put a restriction on prohibiting a drive-through restaurant on parcel 1, because, as I said, the commercial component is actually pulling the residential component of this project, and would for any project on this site. And to handcuff the developer, just in case Longhorn doesn't come in, by prohibiting a drive-through restaurant, even though you would have to, we would agree to a condition that say you have to approve any drive-through restaurant that's there. So you can look at the site plan and make sure that the drive-through window is on the east side of the property, not the west side of the property. You can make sure that there's plenty of buffering. That's the largest site. That's the largest commercial site on there. It's probably more appropriate for a drive-through than the others. We don't really think that restriction is necessary. We think we can comply with your ordinance, and if we can't, then just say no when we come forward to the site plan. But we do agree with all the other staff recommendations. We appreciate the work the staff has done on this, and I can answer any questions.
So
except
is
probably
it your
Sam's.
position not to have any restrictions on any of the lots pertaining to drive-throughs?
No, I think they have to comply with the code, and the facility, the drive-through window itself, can't be adjacent to the residential use that's off-site, but that's it.
Can staff address the point on lot number 1, the proposed Longhorn restaurant and
that's
the
the one
drive-through?
Yeah, in case Longhorn doesn't come there, right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't. What question do you have about?
Can you address? I know you provided some analysis related to that restriction and
Right, I think
condition not to.
yes, the restriction it does apply to the drive-through facility itself, because that's where the impacts occur.
And that's the window.
That's the window and the queuing areas too.
And the
right?
queuing areas.
That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
We agree with that.
I want to be clear on something. Is what you're saying is that this PD is required because the zoning is an economic hardship? Is that what you're saying?
No.
You're saying it can't. That seems to me that's exactly what you said.
I'm saying it's beneficial to the county to have residential uses on this property. I'm saying it is beneficial to the county.
A public benefit.
It's a public benefit to the county to have residential use on this property.
But didn't you also say that there's no way that this property cannot be developed without the commercial property?
That doesn't make it a hardship. That makes it a win-win.
Is it
for both
appropriate
sides.
for the Planning and Zoning Commission to consider the economics potential of a deal one way or the other when considering the zoning? Is that one of the criteria we're meant to do when we're considering land use designations?
I think it's something that you can take into consideration when you've got a proposal that meets your criteria.
I've never seen an economic argument laid out in any of the recommendations you have ever made that, this project, if we do it this way, would be more economically viable. I've never seen staff list that as a criteria in recommending or not recommending.
Well, perhaps I misunderstood. We do not require, and I wouldn't have the expertise to evaluate a pro forma or what the marketability.
So it's not a criteria, and it's merely speculation whether or not at 159 acre units. I mean, I would note also it's next to a state college, so I don't know why it's a bad location necessarily for multifamily, but that's just speculation. I don't really know. I know the zoning is what it is. How long has this been zoned this way?
It was zoned RM6. I mean, I think it's been zoned for multifamily for at least 30 years.
Okay, and when was it zoned from RM6 to RM8?
I'm thinking it was in the early 2000s.
Yeah, I think probably 10 to 15 years ago. That's my recollection. Yeah.
Okay, so for 30 years this has been multifamily.
I believe so. I'm not.
In fact, if anything, it's just gotten more economically viable multifamily because more density has been allowed.
Right, it went from 6 to 8. That's correct.
Okay, so I'm going to say it's not impossible. I don't know for a fact, but I'm guessing that when the proposed developer bought this property, it probably had this zoning on it.
This developer's owned property for over 10 years.
Okay, so it was zoned multifamily when it was purchased.
Yeah.
So
what?
My question is, why restrict it on Lot 1 the fast food restaurant with a drive. That's one of your recommendations.
Because Lot 1 is adjacent, immediately adjacent to 60 Oaks. It's immediately adjacent to the external. It is the lot on the western boundary. If I'll go back to...
I'm looking at the conditions right now as laid out.
Right. And again, I just
Lot
want
1 is this lot, which is immediately adjacent to
But it
60.
states that drive-through facilities shall not be located adjacent to an off-site property.
And what we're saying is right now that's not proposed on
Yep, I got
on
that.
this lot. So let's have a restriction such that we know that it's going to go, the more intense vehicular uses would go on the eastern portions of the site adjacent to a fairly intensely used commercial site now, and limited from being immediately adjacent to a
Understood. Okay.
residential.
So again, the recommended condition goes above and beyond the criteria.
Yeah, it's above the criteria. That was my... Okay.
What are the common architectural themes for the commercial and residential buildings?
In this particular case, we're looking for the, and let me just flip to the,
Let's design a look. Yeah.
we're looking for a similar use of the stone material. We're looking for a similar use of the finish in many respects and the colors. Also tying in some of the roof element from a design, a sloped roof design, not having the commercial buildings have all sloped roof designs, but having sloped elements that are consistent with some of the sloped elements of the residential. So some of these same features from an embellishment standpoint, and those are some of the common themes we're looking at repeating through the architectural standpoint.
A question for Mr. Barquette. Did the 60 Oaks representatives weigh in one way or another on the drive-through for Lot 1?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am. It's been a long day. They have not, but in all fairness, they didn't. We never showed them that it might be a drive-through restaurant. It didn't come up until recently, so they haven't weighed in one way or the other. But they didn't. We didn't ask them either. No.
Thank you.
I better stand up here so I won't fall asleep. Are there any questions for me? Hope not. No?
Anyone
I've got
else?
the project engineer here. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I have
It's been
a
a
question
long
for the
time.
traffic engineer.
I have the-
No,
If
the
the-
project engineer. I don't have a
Project
traffic engineer here.
Okay.
I've got the project
My bad.
engineer. I've got a representative from the applicant here. Okay.
But maybe you can answer the question. I know you're not a traffic engineer, but perhaps you happen to know when they did the traffic impact summary, and on number 6, it says significant intersections, none. Do you know what that could possibly mean? Does that mean 58th and 60th is not a significant? It's the largest intersection in our county. It's
Correct.
got a D- or an F rating, from what I understand.
Right. For the record, Jim Vitter with Kimley Horn and Associates. I'm not the traffic engineer, but I knew the traffic study was submitted and reviewed 2 times by Chris Moore and Jeannie Brissett, the county staff. So, yeah, correct. It says that no intersections are impacted or significantly impacted. But I can't speak to the specifics of the counts, the existing counts on 58th and 60, and what we're putting there from our study.
But the terminology, I'm sorry if I may, the terminology means, and I don't have the exact numbers, but if less than a certain percentage of the intersection's capacity is going to be generated by the project, so let's say it's less than 2%, then the project is not considered significant at the intersection. I don't know if I've got those numbers correct, but that's what the terminology means. So that would mean that this project is not going to generate enough traffic to be more than a certain percentage of the traffic capacity at that intersection, and I think it's 2%.
But our question is whether we're going to rezone it to allow 18,000 additional square feet of commercial as opposed to just 159 units. So obviously there is going to be some marginal additional impact on the intersection.
If you just put a single house on there, there'd be a marginal difference of impact.
Yeah,
on
but
the
what you're
intersection.
asking us
So
to
what
do
you're
is
asking-
zone it from one thing to another.
No, sir. What I'm asking you to do is comply with your traffic engineer's analysis of the traffic study, which indicates that it's not prohibited by your code because for intersection reasons. This is not going to degrade the intersection significantly enough for your traffic engineer to be concerned.
The question is capacity and that intersection specifically relating to its level of activity.
Right. Right. And when he does the traffic study, he's based it on the proposed use, not.
Yeah, understood.
Okay.
I think that strains credulity to think that a drive-through restaurant, two restaurants, one a sit-down restaurant, and perhaps two additional drive-through restaurants, perhaps three, depending on whether we grant the additional request of the applicant, compromising 18,000 square feet would not impact 58th and 60th. I'm not a traffic engineer. That's hard for me to believe.
Yeah. It's a mess. I try to go there and eat. It is a mess there, and there's no doubt about it. I think this compounds it.
Want to turn it over to the public, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, let's open up the public hearing. It's open. Anyone who wishes to speak on this matter, yes, ma'am, please come to the podium and state your name and address for the record, please. Thank you.
My name is Kit Shappy. I'm a resident of 60 Oaks. I live at 1936 60 Oaks Lane. It's lot 51. My lot abuts directly on this property, and it's also it's not quite midway down the street. I have a lot of concerns about the project. I've never been to a hearing like this, so I'll just say what my concerns are and then let you answer when I sit down. The first concern I noted was just that how far back does the commercial area go? Will it abut my property? Will it abut lot 51? That's one question. About the through traffic between College Lane and 60. My concern is that there'll be a lot of kids from the college and from the charter school very interested in those fast food restaurants in the front. It'll be the closest restaurants to the college and the charter school. I think there was a mention that the residential area will be gated, and I wondered if it would be gated 24 hours or if it would be gated only in the evening. As
let me clarify that. It's not gated. Is that correct? It's not gated.
It's not gated.
It's not gated.
Okay. Yeah. It's also a concern about the safety of the students at Charter High School as they would come across that intersection, especially if there's more traffic in that area. Another concern of mine is I know that my property is in a flood zone, so I assume that this area is also in a flood zone. And I wondered how the parking lots from the commercial area and the runoff from that would impact the amount of runoff water. The last reservation I have is, it's last, not least important, but about the drive-throughs. Already in the area as it is, with the drive-through restaurants far away, and even as far as the intersection of 58th and 60, there are, especially at night, there's a lot of noise with people with their boom boxes on in their cars, with their windows rolled down. Sometimes it wakes me up at night, as people are waiting online to go to fast food, especially if the fast food restaurants are open till late at night, this is a big concern for those of us who live we're used to a very quiet neighborhood. And between the fumes from the cars waiting in the queues, the potential for noise, the increased traffic, I'm very concerned about that. So I thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can you go back to the location map again? Because what she just said, I think, is exactly what I said at the beginning, which is that the way it's zoned is appropriate, and it's straight out of a textbook to go from commercial zoning to multifamily to lower density single family for this exact reason, because it's appropriate. It's not appropriate to put fast food restaurants next to, or not as appropriate, next to single family homes. That's why you have a step down in the code, and this is a really great example of it. And what all the concerns she just brought up, noise, environmental, all those things, traffic, safety, those are why when you look in a textbook of how zoning should be done from one parcel to another, you will see it go from the Home Depot to, Home Goods to 8 units to the acre to duplexes to single family, which is exactly what we see here.
But what you're saying, Sam, is you're saying this shouldn't be eligible for mixed use criteria. Is that it? Because that kind of that conflicts with what I understand the overall intent is. This is
well, a couple things. If I could just try to answer the citizens' items here, but I think it's a good point that in a lot of places somebody's going to live next to commercial.
Absolutely,
that's where it's going to be. And sometimes you can separate it by roadways. Of course, you've got roadway noise and so forth. But on this site, if there's going to be any multifamily on it, somebody's going to be next to commercial. But just to give you an idea of where Ms. Chaffee's residence, she's actually kind of got the south of the proposed commercial. And has this preserve area, and then there'll be more landscaping and part of the 6-foot opaque feature is meant to help sound. Obviously, there's no berm or buffer across this cleared field, and so I am sure that noise does travel pretty easily right across this field right now. Intervening buildings and physical berms and buffers and so forth should help that. From these other areas. Wanted to point that out. But exactly the concerns that were brought up about drive-throughs, it is the noise from the cars. It can be noise from speakers. It can be fumes. There's a lot of which is why there are criteria in it, and staff again is recommending not to have it on the parcel that's closest to 60 Oaks. Also, the safety that students, certainly students cross College Lane now, and College Lane, whatever's developed on this site will connect to College Lane, I'm sure, and State Road 60 both, and hopefully interconnect here. I think that, where you actually have entrances, there won't be a crosswalk that I'm aware of that's proposed here. And there are already students that are certainly crossing now to get across, and hopefully putting in sidewalks will at least aid that type of situation. But no question, you have from the charter high school, your kids are going to go to these different commercial places.
In which direction are they going to go? Are they going to go straight through, or are they going to make a few turns and avoid that costly intersection?
Predicting human behavior and then putting on that.
I just
teenage,
from a
I'm
common
not
sense
sure
thing.
I can predict
I have
that.
the answer, but
where everybody else is going.
To her
I guess,
point,
right?
Stan, if I could, there is a crosswalk that the county constructed.
My point.
Yeah. This right here.
Correct.
Yeah. Right. What I'm not sure, and Jim, maybe and while you're up here, because there was one other question about drainage, but is that an actual crosswalk across? Okay, so that location would likely be where they would continue to go. And if you could answer the question on the flood zone, the drainage, the runoff, the existing ditch, and how stormwater is going to be handled.
Correct, and as you said, the site is in a floodplain, so we do have to do floodplain compensation. John, if you could bring up the site plan that shows the stormwater pond. Everything, all the runoff from the site would be routed into that stormwater pond, so we'd have to treat and attenuate the water and account for all the floodplain compensation. It's then discharged to the ditch out on State Road 60, the Indian River Farms Water Control District. the problem becomes with the 60 Oaks ditch is it's lower than what ours is, so we really have to. That's why we wanted to leave that ditch there and not touch it, not contribute to it, because our site's going to be considerably higher than that ditch. So we want to leave that as an independent ditch. It will continue to function as it does now, and I believe on outfalls on both sides to the Indian River Farms and to the College Lane right away.
But generally speaking, you can assure her that laws and so on and so forth, there will be, I think it's safe to say, that there is no law that allows you to off-put any of your water onto her property or any adjoining properties. You have to retain all of your water on for what, a 25-year event, a 100-year event, 20-year event, 25-year event. So you had many legitimate concerns, but I think I can assure you that that is one that probably will not come to pass. That they have to retain their water on site. They're serious about, that's a serious criteria.
Ms. Chappie, your lot is 51? Yes. Okay, thank you.
Anyone else from the public wish to speak on this? Okay, I'm going to close the public hearing. Any discussion from the commissioners amongst ourselves, or any further questions of staff?
Sure, Sam. Question for you. So, which of the criteria is not satisfied here in terms of mixed-use criteria? I know you're making the position that it shouldn't be even eligible for a decision related to mixed-use criteria, but if we go further into that, which of these factors or which of these criteria has the applicant not satisfied?
Great question. First of all, I think, as a starting point, I think
you can go through each one individually. If you
I understand. Generally, let me say that I do not think that this design meets the original intent of what PDM XD was meant to be.
Okay.
And I took you through kind of the reasons for that. I have serious doubts about my 58th and 60 thing. I know that doesn't address your question, but that's one of the things I wanted to say.
Yep.
I think the underlying zoning is already very, very good. Okay, I'm getting to the list of things here.
Yeah, we're starting.
I think there are no. I think there are no public benefits as a starting point. I think there's absolutely no public benefit whatsoever to this, which I think is one of the criterias of the county considering going from one to this PD thing. I do not think that there's obviously. I do not think that the drive-through facilities particularly are a good use in terms of commercial. I do not think there's any meaningful integration between, which I think is what's supposed to happen in a PD, between the commercial and the residential. I do not think that, I think the architectural standards are, meeting the, perhaps meeting the letter, but not the intent of it. It doesn't look to me like it's a grid or modified grid thing. I got to say I care very much less about that. Yeah. Those are some of the things I would say that are my concerns. I think it's an entirely appropriate zoning the way it is now. I think that the way the PD is being used here is just a vehicle for there to be commercial zoning on State Route 60. I think that's what it is, and I think that's evident in the entire design.
Isn't that the overall intent and purpose in developing 60?
No, the zoning for this property is multifamily RM8, and that is the intent.
But in terms of eligibility for consideration for mixed-use criteria, so I think that.
I do not think that this site plan fulfills what the people who wrote the code for. I don't think there's any meaningful integration between the residential and the commercial. This is merely commercial zoning on State Route 60 with a density bonus for the multifamily on the back. But that's my opinion.
Yeah, no.
I think PD is supposed to be more than that. It's supposed to be, hey, we're going to bend the rules, we're going to break the rules, to be able to be creative and do something good here, and to be able to integrate this all together. I think there are examples of that replete through the code and through the recommendations that it be vertical, that there be, there's lots of examples like that. I don't see any of that here. I don't see any of that here.
Anyone else?
I think the question is it 159 units on this property, which is what it's been zoned for 30 years, actually less than that before, or is it 159 units with 18,318 feet of regular old commercial on State Route 60?
Yeah, from where I sit, I think the applicants demonstrated and satisfied the requirements. With one major concern is the traffic considerations on 58th and 60. I'm discounting their report where they say it's not substantive or doesn't have meaningful impact, but that for us, I'd like to have some level of confidence in the traffic implications of such a project and approving such a as staff's recommendations put forward. So that's I'm a bit uncertain in that based on that factor alone.
What's your proposed remedy for reaching a level of comfort with that? Since it's a meaningful concern to you.
Making a more informed decision in hearing and seeing the complete traffic analysis and having a better understanding of it versus, it's going to have a minimal impact as outlined in the report.
Does that mean you're recommending that this proposal be tabled until you get further information?
At least from where I sit today, I wouldn't want to make a decision with that specific issue not unadequately addressed by the applicant, or in this case, I also think that the staff has not satisfied my standard.
Would there be consideration in making that a part of any motion going forward to the board, that the board take further consideration, take testimony or something like that from the traffic engineer, both staff and the applicant, instead of tabling it?
Yeah. Anyone else have any additional thoughts, comments?
No, I agree with you, though. I think there should be more information regarding the traffic. That's my only concern with everything that was brought forth. That's the only thing that, we don't have a traffic engineer to ask on staff or their traffic engineer.
I agree. I think I agree with staff's analysis and recommendations, with the exception of the traffic flow. And so, if we could make a motion that we recommend that that be presented at the board level, I would agree with that.
So what you're saying is you want to punt that up. You want to not make a decision on that ourselves. You don't want to hear the testimony amongst ourselves and be able to decide for ourselves whether we want to make a recommendation based on what we hear. You want that to be taken up to the board level and for them to consider that.
No, what I'm saying is, and it goes back to the last meeting we had where traffic was questioned by Mr. George.
Correct.
Yeah. I have confidence in Indian River County traffic design, but it's clearly raised a question here. And so I don't view it as punting up, as giving them more information to deal with at their level. I don't feel comfortable tabling this.
Mr. Chairman, since you haven't closed the public hearing yet, may I address?
I'm sorry?
Since you haven't closed the public hearing yet, may I address the board?
Yes, please do.
Yeah. Please don't table it. If you want to have more testimony in front of the county commission, we'll provide that. I personally don't know how to say this without offending you, but you really aren't qualified to question the traffic engineer in this case. But if you really want there to be more testimony, don't make us come back here. We're on a very tight schedule, and we've been working on this for a long time. Please make us present more testimony and satisfy your county commission. That would be far preferable than having to, delay this again. Your traffic, if we had known that, if you'd let us know beforehand that was an issue, we could have brought somebody. But it really, when our traffic engineer has worked with your traffic engineer and submitted the traffic study, and your traffic engineer said, no, we need more information, then our traffic engineer provides more information, then your traffic engineer says, fine, we are all satisfied. We sort of think we're done. And unless we know otherwise, to bring people here, it's not fair to penalize us to make us come back here. That's just my input, but
Thank you for that.
I appreciate that.
So we've got two options to consider. One is tabling it. The other is moving it forward and presenting it to the county commissioners.
I'm in favor of moving it forward tonight and not tabling the issue, but what further measures we would be seeking further testimony from the traffic?
Yeah, I think the recommendation would, from the Planning and Zoning Commission, would be to have both the applicant's traffic engineer who prepared the traffic study and the Public Works Director to provide testimony and to go into detail on that.
And I think, the fourth paragraph in the opening page addresses exactly what you can do tonight. You can make a recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners to approve with conditions, or deny the PD rezoning. And I think if one of the conditions would include greater emphasis on the traffic, that would be a condition.
Okay. Does make that? Does someone want to make that motion? I will make a motion to approve staff's recommendation with a further condition to adequately address and have an emphasis on the concerns related to traffic pertaining to the project.
Second.
Let's have a vote. If there's no more discussion, all in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Nay. Motion passes. Item number 5 on our agenda this evening is Commissioners' Matters. Are there any? Seeing as how there are none, item number 6, Planning Matters. Mr. Bowling.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one item. We do have a public hearing scheduled for the next P&Z meeting for the 25th, so we will be having a meeting on the 25th. And that's it, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Item number 7, Mr. DeBral, anything on your corner this evening?
Mr. Chairman.
We are adjourned.